Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is NREL Solar Permitting Tools, an Introduction to SolarAPP and Trace Tool. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. Before I pass it over to our presenters for today's webinar, I'd like to go over a few quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of today's webinar. You can call in via telephone, or you can connect via computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled here. You can also click on that to expand the webinar console. And one thing that you might like to do with your webinar console is to submit your questions and your comments. We would love to hear from you. We're going to be saving about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A with the audience. And we'll get to as many questions as we can. So please do type your questions in when you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar slides and the webinar recording within about 24 hours. We'll also be posting all of those materials on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. So with that out of the way, I'd like to now pass it over to our moderator for today's webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to get us started.
Great, thank you, Samantha, and welcome everyone. Sure enough, I'm Nate Hausman, and I am a project director at CESA, where I focus on solar policy. First, a quick note about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA. We are a national nonprofit coalition of U.S. energy organizations working together to advance the rapid expansion of clean energy technology and bring the benefits of clean energy to all. You can see our members on this slide. Today's webinar is on the Solar Automated Permit Processing Platform Plus, SolarAPP Plus, an online solar permitting platform, and Solar Time-Based Residential Analytics and Cycle Time Estimator, SolarTrace, a tool designed to help identify permitting, inspection, and interconnection cycle times and related requirements nationwide. With us to discuss SolarAPP and SolarAPP Plus and SolarTrace is Jeff Cook from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. I'm going to introduce Jeff, and then I'm going to turn it over to him to present and to provide us with a demo. But before I do, I want to remind you to type in your questions into the questions box as we go. So with those preliminaries out of the way, let me introduce Jeff Cook. Jeff Cook is a renewable energy market and policy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. He has been on staff at NREL since 2014 and focuses on state and local policy, permitting, resilience, technology cost reduction, and distributed energy resource aggregation. He received his Ph.D. in political science from Colorado State University in 2017, where he was an instructor of environmental and public policy courses. He received his Master of Science in Environmental Science and Policy from the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay in 2012. Okay, take it away, Jeff. Platform's yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nate. And really excited to be here to walk through a lot of the great work that we're doing at NREL in relation to residential rooftop solar and distributed solar generally. And so before we get too far into the meat of the discussion, I do have a couple of poll questions I wanted to ask. And so Sam can pull up the first one. In short, what we're interested in learning a bit more from you all is just your background and whether or not you've heard about SolarAPP before. And so I just wanted to give everyone a little bit of time to answer that first question. I think if I stop sharing the screen, Sam, I would see the poll questions on my side, or might not see those.
It's possible, but right now I'm going to close the poll, and then I'm going to put the results up on the screen. So 46% have said yes, that they have heard of it before.
Oh, great. That's wonderful to hear. So then we can go ahead and move to our next poll question as well. And so, Sam, apologies, I don't remember how we organized. Could you just describe what that poll question is?
Sure. So the question is, have you heard of SolarTrace before? It's a yes or no question. So people are
oh, great. Yeah.
are responding now.
And it's great to hear that about half of you have heard of SolarAPP before, so this will be a little bit of a refresher for some of you, but also we'll be introducing some of the developments that have happened around SolarAPP, including our pilot results. So even if you've heard about SolarAPP before, I'm sure there'll be something new you'll hear today. So I'm excited to have both some new folks and, of course, about half that have heard before. SolarTrace is new, though, so we can close that poll, and I'm assuming that fewer of you have heard of that one.
Yes, we only had 7% who have heard of SolarTrace before, 93% had not.
Awesome. All right, well, that means everyone on this call is going to learn a lot about SolarTrace today, a tool that we're really excited about for using to be able to have transparency into permitting, inspection, and interconnection cycle times nationwide, not just those that use SolarAPP. And the final piece is we just want to get a sense of your roles at your institutions, just to get a sense of who's on the call today. And that way I can help tailor a little bit of our conversation to who we've got on the call. So I know the roles don't perfectly align. We had limitations in how many roles to put there. So just put whatever's closest to how you view your role at your organization or your institution generally.
Right, votes are still rolling in here, so I'm going to give it one more minute.
No problem.
Okay, so the results of that poll, what role best fits your organization, we had 50% stakeholder or other, 26% state government, 10% local government, 7% solar contractor, and 7% research and development.
Fantastic. So we've got a good organization or good collection of folks on the call today, and about what I suspected. And so this program or this webinar should be well tailored to you all, especially focused on how states and local governments in particular, as well as stakeholders, can use the information today that you're going to hear about with SolarTrace and SolarAPP to be able to speak to how we could work together to streamline and improve permitting, inspection, and interconnection across the country. So the webinar today, we're going to do we're going to do a lot today. So we're going to talk a little bit about NREL's analysis in the permitting, inspection, interconnection space. I also refer to this as PII, so if you hear me say that, it means the same thing. Ultimately, we'll talk about that. Then I'll do live demonstrations of both the SolarTrace tool and SolarAPP, in addition to giving you some details about both of those products, and in particular for SolarAPP, some of the piloting results that we've seen so far. So for those of you who are not aware, NREL is a part of the U.S. Department of Energy. We're one of 17 national laboratories or research facilities that are all housed within the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm particularly proud of this project, both tools, because they are related to the partnership piece there that you see. We are very committed to partnering with industry, academia, and government to solve the problems that they face today in the market. And so I'm really excited about this being one of those success stories of a partnership that effectively works here at the lab. And so for anyone interested in partnering with us going forward on anything you hear today or otherwise, by all means, reach back out to me to talk through that. So that'd be at my email, which is just first name, last name @nrel.gov. And I'll be sharing that out later, but it's jeff.cook@nrel.gov. So ultimately, in the context of permitting, inspection, and interconnection, we've done analysis and software development. Here you're seeing the SolarAPP, but now we can also put the SolarTrace tool, which has also been developed, which is exciting. So ultimately, we've taken a two-pronged approach to do data analysis and increase transparency into how requirements influence adoption time and potentially cancellation rates across jurisdictions and utilities. And that's what the SolarTrace is designed around. In addition, we're identifying how requirements such as online or instant permitting review for plan review can influence cycle times for permit review time, in addition to things like SolarAPP, which can deliver that instantaneously. And finally, the goal is to just increase transparency around that nationwide so everyone is on a level playing field to know about how long it would take to permit a system, get it inspected and interconnected, et cetera. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is the SolarTrace tool. This is publicly available for you, and Sam's going to throw the link here in the chat so you can actually follow along yourself or actually do your own scenarios in your own jurisdictions if you so choose. But ultimately, what I'll do today is show you a little bit about the tool. So SolarTrace was developed by collecting cycle time data. So that is the time it took to get specific jobs adopted or installed from contract signed, so a homeowner is interested in the project, all the way through permission to operate with the utility and installation in between those elements. So we tracked all of that for all of the states you see here. The darker blue states are those where we had a lot more data, which tracks the market generally. And so for those that are lighter or white, we have very limited data in those places. And then the grayed out states, we don't have any data. So if you are in one of those states for which we don't have data, or you just want to help us expand the data we do have in the states listed, please do, again, reach out to me. We're trying to we are going to expand this to include 2020 and 2021 data in the future. So ultimately, though we have coverage in some 30-odd states, we're really focused on 740 jurisdictions and approximately 100 utilities to track the cycle time data or the permitting times, the inspection times, et cetera. And ultimately, we put a cut point in any jurisdiction or utility with 10 or more installs. With utilities, actually, it was a bit higher cut points as well. And so ultimately, we had about 200,000 systems in the data set from 2017 to 19, which serve as the basis for our evaluation. And so let me pull up the tool. And so again, thanks, Sam, for throwing that in the chat so anyone can get to it by going to, it's also housed on SolarAPP, so that's helpful for folks. So if you're already on SolarAPP, you can get to SolarTrace. So what does the tool do? So you start by identifying a community for which you want to evaluate cycle time. So I pulled in Los Angeles here. And what's interesting is you can compare it to its peers by just clicking on the map or by entering in a community into the drop down or the search bar. You can also pick different years to see how cycle times have evolved over time. And then generally speaking, we have the most data from 1 to 10 kW systems, but we also have a filter for 11 to 50 kW systems, which are just larger, typically residential projects. So what the tool will do is show you exactly how long it'll take to permit. Well, excuse me, it will show you the median permitting time, and you can compare that across jurisdictions and utilities that serve those jurisdictions, which it can be really valuable. So as a descriptor here, I pulled in Los Angeles City, compared it to Los Angeles County and Lancaster, all within the county of Los Angeles. And you can see permitting times do in fact vary. So Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, has an instant online permitting system in place for solar, much like SolarAPP. And so ultimately, you can see that Los Angeles, the city, has a 0 permitting timeline if you would hover over this to evaluate it. Ultimately, though, the flip side of that is that Los Angeles County and Lancaster do about 2-3 days permitting to up to 10 days for business days for permitting. In comparison, though, they are served by utilities that do not have a pre-install approval to build process. So ultimately, in contrast, Los Angeles City does. So the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power does have a pre-install application review process. So what's interesting here, that's about 8 days. And so there's really no net gain ultimately in Los Angeles, like maybe a couple of days when you compare to Los Angeles County, because Los Angeles County is doing a permit review. LA isn't doing that, but functionally the utility is doing a pre-approval. So there's no net savings in cycle time there. But ultimately then, if you compare with the inspections, you can see about how long that takes. And then the post-install side as well. So over there, you can see LADWP takes about 8 days to do its post-install review processes. In comparison, Southern California Edison and Southern San Diego Electric, both serving Los Angeles County in some capacity, have a lot lower post-install review times and a lot lower pre-install review times, which is interesting, right? That begs the question about what is LADWP doing that requires both extensive reviews. In contrast, why is San Diego Gas and Electric able to do it faster than LADWP? Same question on the permitting side, though I've already articulated why that may be. In addition, if you scroll into this and dig a little deeper, you can start to see how permitting entities, organizations, cities, authorities having jurisdiction, also another way to refer to them. You can start to see some of the elements that we're tracking related to their processes. So whether they're SolSmart designated, whether they have an instant online permitting process, and ultimately whether they do same-day in-person permitting. So that may be one reason why Lancaster is faster than LA County, and Los Angeles is even faster given they do the instant online permitting, even though all three theoretically offer some sort of online application process. So that helps to dig into some of why the data is different. The same on the utility side, and I'll bring you right to the approval to build requirement, which is what I talked about before. Certainly there are other elements as well that can influence process time, which are also articulated here. Finally, you can compare to the state median cycle time for all of the relevant processes as it relates to those included up here. So Los Angeles, for example, Los Angeles County is actually above the median for California. And then if you actually bring in somewhere in Nevada, for example, you can start to see how California compares overall to Nevada. So in context of permitting time, actually Nevada's doing it same day, which is better than the state of California overall. However, you can see their total cycle time for install processes is actually longer. And I can explain that potentially also by what's happening with the utility. So now just focusing on Clark County, we'll do that for a second in Nevada. So ultimately here, you can see their pre-install application processes and their post-install application processes for interconnection are quite long, even though their permitting timeline is instantaneous. And so, by the way, Clark County serves it houses Las Vegas, if you're not familiar with the geography. So I pulled in Las Vegas here as well. What's interesting too is if you start tracking back to years prior, and I'll get rid of Las Vegas for a second here, what you can see is that there was an 8-day permitting review time for Clark County in 2018. In 2019, that went away. It's 0. Why is that? Because they adopted an instant online permitting process in the community, which you can now identify from the tool. So ultimately, there's a lot that you can do with this data set, and I'm just showing you a snapshot of a couple places. But like I said, there's almost 30-odd states in here that you can already evaluate the cycle times and compare across them. So that's a little bit about where we are with the Solar Trace tool. And of course, if you have questions about Solar Trace, by all means, please do throw those in the question and answer section, and we'll come back to them. But ultimately, what that tool, and you've heard several times, is what instant online permitting can do to streamline permitting processes in jurisdictions that have that option available to them. And so ultimately, that was the goal of the SolarAPP Plus project, is that we know Los Angeles and Las Vegas and a couple of other cities service the models, but they spent a lot of time and resources developing those online systems in order to be able to automate permit review for residential systems. And so what we wanted to do is bring that opportunity to the rest of the country and all those jurisdictions that maybe don't have the in-house resources to do it. And we wanted to do this because we know solar markets are rapidly increasing, and every one of those PV systems needs to be reviewed permitted and inspected before you can turn it on for PTO. And so that becomes a big burden for jurisdictions that have to process thousands of applications, hundreds of applications a month, and don't necessarily have more staff to accommodate that. And then at the same time, we know that a lot of these residential PV systems for which they're getting a ton of applications, they're typically very consistent in that they use a couple of inverter architectures, microinverters, string inverters, AC modules, and there's also a set of common point of interconnection methods and a variety of other elements that make residential PV systems often very common, similar, typical systems that jurisdictions see hundreds of these applications and have to approve, but don't necessarily have a lot of corrections on them because they're very consistent from contractors. And so these are some of the key questions we usually ask jurisdictions, is to look back historically to think about how solar markets are expanding in their community, how they're processing those permits today, what issues do they face with those permits. One of the key consistent issues we hear for them is that they get a lot of revisions from contractors. So not only are they reviewing 100 applications a month once, they're reviewing probably 50 of those same applications again, if not a third time, when they send back corrections and follow up with incomplete applications, et cetera. So SolarAPP actually can address all of that for all of the eligible systems, for which we expect about 80 to 90% of residential solar projects today could qualify for instant online permitting within SolarAPP, which is similar to what Las Vegas and Los Angeles' metrics look like. So ultimately, the goal of this is to reduce those constraints on jurisdictional personnel. It's also to remove the incomplete or inaccurate applications from their queues, so they're not performing QA for free for contractors. In addition, this accommodates the ability for those jurisdictional staff to focus on the more complex projects they're also getting more of, like commercial projects, for example. There are a lot more solar projects coming through in that space, in addition to the building boom that's going on in a lot of communities today that also require permitting, or the reinvestment and redevelopment of areas within communities that need to be permitted and inspected as well. And so this is designed to help jurisdictions with the constraints they have, in addition to supporting economic development and renewable energy commitment goals. So for example, San Jose went instant and online permitting, and then after that, they saw a 600% increase in solar deployment. We can't attribute all of that, of course, to going instant and online permitting, but there's a real benefit to that and a real interest from installers, because that would give them business certainty about when they can install their system and schedule an inspection. So it makes intuitive sense that you would see that expansion in the market, in addition to just all of the other benefits of the market right now in terms of economic and cost savings that homeowners are experiencing. At the same time, the faster we get the systems installed, the faster consumers can benefit. So there's a win for consumers as well, not just in reducing overall cost of the system that they paid for. So ultimately, that sounds like a lot of great stuff. So how does SolarAPP actually do any of that stuff? Ultimately, it's an online web-based permitting tool. It's offered at no cost to jurisdictions. In contrast, contractors pay a $25 per permitted system that goes through SolarAPP to maintain the product going forward. And I say maintain the product going forward because we brought all of the code entity organizations together that you see here, including NFPA, ICC, UL, IAEI, jurisdictions, contractors, and subject matter experts across the market. We brought them together to evaluate the existing model codes, that is the 2017 National Electrical Code, the 2018 International Building Code, and the 2018 International Residential Code. Those are the most commonly adopted codes across the country today. More recently, NFPA and others have developed the National Electrical Code, of the 2020 version of that. Similarly, ICC and others have developed the 2021 I Code. So if a jurisdiction adopted this themselves, folks like Los Angeles and Las Vegas, they're actually going to have to update their own systems once they go to the 2020 and 2021 cycles. Massachusetts, Colorado, California are all either have adopted the 2020 codes or will be adopting them shortly. And so ultimately, the SolarAPP is going to use the funding from contractors to help update the system going forward, such that it can continue to be used at no cost to jurisdictions as they adopt new and upcoming model codes. In addition, the tool not only delivers an automated and instant plan review along with a permit issuance, it also provides a clear inspection checklist that can be used by the inspector. It's consistent and standardized for every job they're going to see, instead of seeing a million different single line diagrams that they see today. We're also very excited to say that it integrates with existing software systems that jurisdictions are already using. So if you might have heard about our release or partnership with Acela, for example, and we're already running with the template they've developed in Menifee, California, and it took Menifee about 10 hours total. That's 10 hours total to be able to deploy the SolarAPP in the pilot and start to see real time savings from automated and instant plan review, which is really exciting. So ultimately, we're moving to the launch phase in that we've already launched actually in Pima County, Arizona, Tucson, Arizona, and Pleasant Hill, California. We're issuing every every contractor has the opportunity to use SolarAPP to get an instant permit issued for their project, assuming it's eligible. We're moving to the full launch to the nation in June, and hopefully scheduling a big launch with big name entities across the country. So please do stay tuned for that, and we'll definitely let CISA and your membership know when that webinar and that virtual launch is scheduled. Ultimately, we've also announced that the tool is going to be transitioned to UL to be the long-term program manager of that project. So NREL is going to, of course, continue to be a part of it, but UL as a private entity is going to run this going forward. Overall, there are 2 ways to implement SolarAPP via those quote-unquote integration pathways I'd mentioned previously. So ultimately, a lot of jurisdictions already have some sort of permitting software. And if that permitting software, like Acella's Citizen Access portal, if it allows for online permitting in that a contractor is allowed to register, sign in, submit their application, and get a permit automatically out of that system, this is the platform and the process you would use with SolarAPP. So SolarAPP Plus would do the automated compliance checks and plan review, and then the contractor would take that information, upload it into your jurisdictional permitting system. They'd get a permit record and a permit job card just as they would get today, except the key here is that you did not, as a jurisdiction, have to do a plan review, which is huge because that's a lot of time savings, which I'll get into in a second. For those jurisdictions that don't have an online and interactive web-based platform to do that type of permitting, SolarAPP can also serve you. So ultimately, if you have a backend system, which everybody does, SolarAPP can actually issue the permit on your behalf for solar projects that are eligible. And then ultimately, you would take that permit information from SolarAPP and input it into your existing system to generate a permit record on your side and also ultimately allow for inspection. So that's all to say that there are more than one way for jurisdictions to adopt. As I mentioned, these 3 jurisdictions were a part of our first phase of piloting communities. And so here you can see Pima County and Tucson process a lot of permits, over 100 permits, at least on average, a month. And so ultimately, they needed to find a way to do this more efficiently because they didn't have the staff to do it to improve their own customer service. On the flip side, even if you don't process hundreds of applications, SolarAPP can still be valuable to you because it improves your process and makes it more efficient. That's partially why Pleasant Hill, California adopted it to be as effective and be as helpful to their consumers or customers as possible. Ultimately, here's a little bit more detail on every one of those communities and how they compare. Ultimately, it also demonstrates some of the average permitting and review times. So I wanted to flag for you here that it takes about 8 days on average to get a permit at Pima County, 11 days on average in Tucson. Importantly, in 2020 and 2021, Tucson actually had that permitting review time jump from 11 days to 21 days. That's 21 business days. That's almost 5 weeks of delay. And it's not that Tucson or anyone is waiting or sitting on these applications. It's just they don't have the staff to review them in time efficiently. So SolarAPP takes that away from the process. And oh, by the way, Pima County and Tucson dropped down their fee a little bit as well. So the contractor saw a benefit there. Of course, that's not mandatory to do for SolarAPP, but it is what Pima County and Tucson decided to do in their process. So we had a variety of contractors, of course, participating in the pilots, many of them flagged here. And then ultimately, here's a little bit of insight into what projects have gone through the app. So ultimately, this is tables from about a month ago, but excitingly, we now have 195 applications that have run through SolarAPP Plus and gotten an instant plan review. So ultimately, if you think it took about an hour to do that plan review for the 195 jobs, that's 195 hours of savings already. In addition, Menifee, California has already processed 7. So if you recall, it took them about 10 hours to adopt it, and we already removed 7 hours of plan review time. So that's really exciting and showing those benefits of the pilot. In addition, as I'd mentioned, Tucson, for example, has taken about 21 business days to review a solar permit today in that traditional column, AKA, their regular process. SolarAPP, of course, for all 3 jurisdictions, instantaneous permitting, which is really a big deal. You've cut 5 whole business weeks out of the process, or 4 business weeks, I should say, out of the process. So that's some of the benefits of SolarAPP. But why don't we now take a look at SolarAPP under the hood a little bit more? So ultimately, I'm going to just give you a brief overview and rundown of the SolarAPP itself. Basically from the login of the process from the contractor side. So ultimately, the contractor would sign into the SolarAPP project, and then it would ultimately be able to develop new projects. So the contractor would first, though, have to verify their license information, that it's eligible to be able to pull a permit in a jurisdiction. And then, importantly, it has to flag an address that's viable in that jurisdiction. So for example, this address, though it says Tucson in it, one might think that's Tucson, Arizona, the city of Tucson. Unfortunately, that address is actually in the unincorporated area of Pima County. And so the contractor wouldn't be able to pull a permit in Tucson for that address unless, of course, they couldn't in Tucson, but they could in Pima County, so they could move forward to continue the application. So we're verifying the addresses as well, and certainly that would be verified as well by the jurisdiction in question. So I'm not going to do that project from the start. Oops. I'm not going to do that project from the start. Instead, I'm going to show you a project that I've already done at that same address. So you can see that same address here for Pima. So ultimately, they would, if the contractor is, of course, eligible to even file for a permit in a jurisdiction, they would then get to the eligibility page. So some of you may be asking, what is eligible in SolarAPP? And I mentioned it is new rooftop residential PV systems only. So we're not doing commercial systems right now, and we're not doing ground-mounted systems. We're also not doing any solar integrated products like solar roof stuff that you may have heard about. At current, we are also not doing storage either. And I said at current, and that is because we're expecting to expand to storage first, residential storage first, and we're expecting to do that by the end of the summer. And then we'll be expanding to other technologies and all of those that I've mentioned already into the future, but we are starting with the residential system. Of course, there's a lot of requirements and limitations around electrical, structural, and fire as to what's allowable for automated compliance checks. So as you heard me say before, we expect about 80% of permitted systems, residential PV systems, could run through SolarAPP. But that leaves about 20% that wouldn't qualify, but could be approved via traditional processes. So the expectation is if we're taking 80% of 100 permits out of the queue, a jurisdiction can spend the rest of their time getting the queue cleared faster for those remaining 20 jobs or so. Happy to talk through the eligibility requirements going forward. Importantly, if you are interested in adoption, again, the key ones are to be eligible to use SolarAPP, you need to either be using the National Electrical Code, the 2017 version of that, and the 2018 International Residential and International Building Codes. If you are not on those codes, but rather you're on the 2020 or 2021 vintages, that is great. We will serve you this summer as well. If you are on the earlier code, the 2014 and 15 code vintages, you are not eligible to use SolarAPP, and ultimately you would have to change and update to the new model codes in order to be able to use that. So I know there are some states over the whole state where jurisdictions are on the 2015 or 14 series of code. And so that would be something states might want to consider for eligibility for SolarAPP, is to consider what code years they're on, because we're now into the 2021 and 2020 model codes. So we are moving ahead on a 3-year cycle. Ultimately, if eligible, the contractor would go to the fire page. We ask a series of questions here, and then we document all of the fire requirements they're required to comply with. I'm not going to spend too much time walking through this other than to say we do track the fire code requirements in terms of setbacks, and that's the 18-inch or 3-foot setbacks depending on how much area of the roof the PV array takes up. And so we do specify that and require that of the contractor to tell us all of that information. Ultimately, from there, they have to follow the structural requirements embedded within the application. And so importantly, we do not require professional engineer stamps here to be able to approve compliance. Rather, we ask the contractor to verify compliance by their inputs to the structural page. If their inputs are out of compliance, they would be rejected and not able to move forward. And so we encourage jurisdictions to think through how our compliance checks compare to their PE stamp requirements and how we may adjust those or work together to understand how to address those going forward. Ultimately, the electrical page is the heart of the application. There is a lot, of course, going on with circuits and inverters, et cetera, on the electrical side. Ultimately, I've mentioned before that there are some common inverter architectures like string inverters without DC to DC converters, along with AC mods, microinverters, and then string with DC converters. Those are all allowable within SolarAPP. We're verifying certifications for the equipment being able to be used together, at least on the inverter and the module side. On the rapid shutdown side, we're asking contractors to input all the relevant information that demonstrates UL compliance with the relevant certifications. In addition, we have a variety of installation-related questions as well. So importantly, the tool will reject folks in-app if something is incorrect and they can't move forward. In addition, we verify that at the end of the process as well. So before I get there, though, we also ask a lot of questions about the circuit, the wire and conduit sizing is based on that, as well as asking questions about the point of connection at the main panel. So what's nice about this tool is it offers a variety of common point of interconnection compliance methods, and not just one or two, which has been limitations of other systems in the past. And so here, I'm going to show you what happens when you put in an error into the tool. So right now, my compliance method will not work based on the main breaker and bust and, and rating I have here for service. And so ultimately, though, each input I put in here was by itself possibly code compliant. So when I submit my project in aggregate, the tool is going to reject me, and it's going to tell me why. It's going to tell me that point of connection method is out of compliance, it's not code compliant, and there's a way for me to solve it by looking back at my design. So in this particular case, it's going to be like, oh, okay, I actually was just going through my application a little too quickly. Looking back at my design, I realized I wanted the 120% rule, of course, which qualifies based on my main breaker and service rating sizes. So it's easy for the contractor to confirm that on their side. Then they submit their project again. They did this all without having to send anything to the jurisdiction. So instead of having the jurisdiction send it back and say, hey, your system's not code compliant, instead the application did that, and it did it instantaneously. So not only did it save time for the contractor, it saved time for the jurisdiction as well. Ultimately, this project was code compliant, and so then I get to my preview page, and then I can ultimately move forward from here to payment. So ultimately, I'm going to just zoom in a little bit on this inspection checklist so you can see that. So what's exciting about this is at no point in time did you hear me say, here's where we're going to talk, or here's where they upload a single line diagram, a 3-line diagram, a site plan, or anything like that. Instead, what you're seeing here is an inspection checklist that starts at the main service panel, and it works its way up step by step all the way to the roof. What it's doing here for an inspector is it's designed to help a combo inspector that A, hasn't seen any solar before, or B, didn't get training on what to inspect with a solar system, or C, it's an inspector that's done 1,000 of these, and this is just a guide for them to carry out their inspection. So ultimately, what we're doing, though, is making this a lot easier for any one of those inspectors by starting and giving them a prescriptive checklist to verify everything on this checklist was done out in the field. And if not done out in the field, then ultimately the inspector would fail the application, and they would go back, the contractor would have to go back to SolarAPP and revise it and resubmit the application to ensure it is code compliant. So as an inspector, I'd go to the main service panel, I'd verify the voltage at the panel, I'd verify what compliance method they're doing, I'd verify that they actually carried out that compliance method. Then I would go to the main breaker and I would check to see, is it a 175 amp main breaker? Let's say it's a 200 amp main breaker. It's fairly common to have 200 amp main breakers out there in the field. Inspector goes out, sees that, sees that the inspection checklist says it's supposed to be 175 amps. They would fail that inspection because it's not what's on the plan. And so fundamentally, inspections do not change. Ultimately, they do the same thing, but instead of getting a million single line diagrams that they need to interpret individually for every unique contractor, instead they'll get the standardized checklist, taking them all the way through the process and making it more clear the key elements that they should be evaluating on site. Things like the inverter type and manufacturer. Again, if the different, let's say they go and they see an N-phase inverter out there at the site, instead of, in this case, there's a Tesla inverter. So let's assume it was N-phase. Ultimately, they fail that inspection as well, because it's not, again, what was approved during plan review. And so it's very similar in that respect to what's happening in the field. And then there's, of course, other key elements in the install details all the way up to the roof to verify everything was done and up to code. In addition, the inspector would verify the fire setbacks are the, in this case, 18-inch setbacks from the ridge, the hips and valleys, and the 3-foot emergency escape pathways. They'd be sure to verify those out in the field if they're there, and if not, again, the inspector would fail the inspection. So what's exciting is we've piloted the tool with inspectors in those communities I'd mentioned before, and all the inspectors have been favorable to this checklist, even though it's new. which we were surprised about. We got a lot of favorable responses, and in addition, it doesn't take, it takes about 1 or 2 minutes longer to do an inspection with this checklist, and that's only based on the initial subset of checklists and inspections that have been done. And so ultimately, we expect it to take, and the inspectors have told us that they don't expect using this inspection checklist is going to take any longer to do their inspections. So right now, it's about 1 to 2 minutes for them to get up to speed on how to use it. And then after that, they expect it actually might even go faster because everything is clearly laid out and they know how to fail inspections ultimately if they're not up to speed. In addition, out in the field, the inspector could always pull up the QR code of the most recent job to evaluate what's actually in SolarAPP for that project. So the inspector, of course, doesn't have to do that, but they certainly could do it if they so chose. Ultimately, as I said before, we've had Menifee starting to pilot the project as well, and so we're really excited to hear what their inspectors say about it because we've already made revisions to this checklist based upon what those inspectors from the first phase have told us to improve. And so we're really excited to see how those go as well. And so ultimately, I think I've given us a lot of time for some questions from the group here today, and really excited to hear from you all and try to answer as many questions as I can. So with that, I'll bring Nate back into the conversation, and I'll pop
Thanks,
on
Jeff.
webcam here as well.
That was great. It's a slick platform. So we've got a bunch of questions, and I'll start firing them off. First question you answered part of already, but I'm curious to the other pieces of it. Systems, the question, it says, systems are trending toward more storage and vehicle charging and discharging with vehicle grid integration. Do these apps contemplate these more resilient, sophisticated systems? I know you said storage will be coming on by the end of the summer. What's sort of the timeline for some of the more complicated systems?
Great question. So yeah, we are running to beat the market, right? So for just 6 months ago, maybe even 12 months ago, storage was a lot less common, even in California. But with wildfires and interest in voluntary shutoffs of power, people are a lot more interested in deploying more more storage. And so ultimately, those jurisdictions, contractors are seeing that their systems have flipped, where they're seeing 60-40 solar projects versus solar when it was, 25-75% before. So we are actively working to get storage embedded in the tool. We're already piloting it in Pima County, Tucson, and Pleasant Hill, but we need to go through a diligent vetting process for the permitting requirements as we did for solar. So we still need to engage the code official entities and organizations. After we've gotten through the proof of concept phase, we want to work with all of them to make sure our requirements are up to speed and code. And so that's the storage piece of it, a little bit more detail there. Electric vehicle infrastructure, we hear you on that. That's on our product roadmap as well. So we do expect to put out quarterly updates on new features. So for example, we've also heard about main panel upgrades and being able to derate main panels. Both of those are now accommodated in SolarAPP or in the process of being accommodated in SolarAPP based on feedback from our partners. So over the course of the next year, I would say to keep checking back with us in the website to be able to see what new technologies are coming on board because we are actively moving ahead beyond just solar to include all of those distributed technologies, including, expanding to commercial segments as well. That's further off on the pipeline for the process, but we are engaging on it.
Great, thanks. Next question is SolarAPP Plus a competitive tool to something like PowerClerk from Clean Power Research?
Great question. It is not competitive, and actually we're working with PowerClerk to make them complementary or used in tandem. So ultimately, SolarAPP is a permitting platform. PowerClerk is an interconnection platform. And so ultimately, what we're hoping to do is have SolarAPP's inputs and information be able to automatically be fed into PowerClerk to actually remove some of the human need for input and following of those projects in between them. And so we're actively working with PowerClerk, and we're happy to work with all other software vendors. A good other example is with government software vendors already. So this is not a competitive product to them. It's a plug-in and benefit to jurisdictions within the systems they're already using. Similarly, on the inspection side, SolarAPP is not a current doing inspections or allowing for inspections within the application. So ultimately, you could use whatever application you're already using for that service to schedule and manage your inspection processes. And so we are excited to be working with PowerClerk and every one of those other software providers to allow for automated and instant plan review in the permitting space.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Next question, municipalities have to consider whether a solar project is consistent with national standards as well as whether it complies with solar municipal ordinance zoning, for example. So an automatic approval must deal with both. So how does zoning get incorporated into this? Yeah, is there a way to do that?
Great question. Yeah, so how this is done now is based, and it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction discussion, except for California. So in the context of California, solar is exempt from zoning and planning requirements and related ordinances. So in the context of California, that is not and cannot be incorporated into it. And at the same time, that's not, of course, universal across the country. So in those places where you can only site in a residential, neighborhood, of course, and that, of course, important, those elements we can work through with the jurisdictions in question and how they are already processing that within their systems today. So SolarAPP accommodates that through our evaluation of addresses with our use of census data, et cetera, or census tract data. Ultimately, a lot of jurisdictions also have adopted local amendments to the model codes in question. So in the context of California, that's Title 24. Functionally, California is the same as the model codes, but in other jurisdictions, you can add local amendments. SolarAPP isn't going to be adopting universally wholesale those local amendments. We would walk through each and every one of those on a case-by-case basis to identify and confirm the public health and safety aspects of each one of those local amendments. So for example, if a jurisdiction requires painting the conduit to match the outside aesthetic of the home, that is not something that SolarAPP is going to accommodate as a local amendment of any kind, because it's not focused on public health and safety. And so those are going to be questions those will be engaging discussions with every jurisdiction. And I will say we have made improvements and are making adjustments based on local amendments that we've identified from other communities. So it's not a shut door, but that is something we would want to discuss on a case-by-case basis. In addition, for those that have historic districts, for example, Tucson, the city of Tucson, has excluded historic districts from being able to process a permit via SolarAPP automatically. So some of that can be dealt with via exclusions to the application.
Okay, next question. Is the difference between this platform and other online permit platforms the instant plan review? Is that the key difference?
Absolutely. So it's important to note that there are thousands of government software vendors out there that will process or allow for a contractor to process a permit online today. There are thousands, well, maybe not thousands, but there's certainly hundreds of them. And SolarAPP is not designed to replace any of that. SolarAPP is designed to allow and open the door for, as you said, instant online approval. That is the key here. So any government software vendor today can do a permit process online that is not instant. This tool, in combination with whatever product you're already using, together delivers an instant permit. And that is the critical thing that SolarAPP is designed to do. Certainly, jurisdictions are welcome to adopt and develop their own version of SolarAPP, and we're happy for those jurisdictions that have done that, like Los Angeles and Las Vegas. The expectation is most jurisdictions do not have the resources to do that or to update it going forward, in which case they'd want to use the SolarAPP in partnership or collaboration with their software. So if you leave today with any knowledge of this tool, be clear that we are working in partnership with your existing jurisdictions' government software platforms and not against them.
Thank you. Next question, this person notes that they're on an older vintage of the code and so aren't eligible. So the question is, when you update to the new codes, will you allow a subset of states to stay on the old 2017, 2018 codes?
Yes, great question. So at current, yes, those that are still on 2017, 18 can continue on those. And then those on 2020 and 2021 as well can continue on those. As we get into the 2024, the 2023, 2024 series of code, then we'll start to want to revisit 2017 vintages and determine whether that should also be retired. Because as you know, we're not going back to the 2014 or 15 series, and there's a reason for that. All of these organizations come together to discuss improvements to the model codes such that the model code is meeting technologies as close to where they are today. So some folks are still on the 2008 National Electrical Code. And as all of you know, the market has come probably a century, right, in the past 11 years or so. And so we would not expect to continue to allow jurisdictions to stay on that 2017-18 series in perpetuity.
Great. Next question is, how can I locate AHJs who are using SolarAPP or SolarTrace and or get updates about as more AHJs adopt these programs?
Great question. So first of all, SolarTrace is just available online. You can use it today. So in terms of that, you can see all the jurisdictions in there. The data is all available as well to see all the data that we have related to jurisdictions. So you can do that all now. In addition, the website's been redesigned, and there is a complementary site where we are identifying the knowledge base and everything in that regard. Knowledge base, which has all the information of all the jurisdictions that have adopted, their performances, et cetera. So that's all available on the website as well. And then finally, there is, of course, also a newsletter that you can sign up for. So we encourage you to reach out to us or check out the website to find that. Of course, if you are a jurisdiction or a contractor, you're welcome to register in the system itself. And then you would get all the updates on all of that. And of course, anyone that's on a state side and interesting to partner with us to engage in providing SolarAPP to your jurisdictions, we actively encourage all of you to reach out to solarapp@nrel.gov or to me at jeff.cook@nrel.gov to talk about how we could partner together and maybe do a webinar like this with jurisdictions in your state.
Thanks. Next question says there's apparently a goal to have this software cover 90% of residential solar and solar plus storage by 2030. How realistic do you think that goal is? And is that in fact a goal?
Yes, we are actively moving forward to try and make sure that the whole country is doing instant and online permitting for solar projects. And we totally expect that that's capable and possible to be done by 2030 for a variety of reasons. One, this tool is available at no cost to jurisdictions to adopt. And two, we're talking about 90% of the solar market. So right now, functionally, about 100 jurisdictions total are about 75% of the whole solar market. So it's not a lot of jurisdictions that would need to be doing instant and online permitting in order to accommodate where the market is today. Certainly, we hope the market rapidly expands nationwide. And that's the beauty of the SolarAPP, is that it's at no cost to jurisdictions. So even if you're a low volume jurisdiction, but you want to benefit from the value and performance of SolarAPP in not only providing better value to your consumers, your customers, your homeowners, but also to improve the efficiency of your own process, we actively encourage you to sign up and do so now.
Great, and this gets at some of what you just stated, but you said there's no cost for jurisdictions to sign up, and certainly large volumes of efficiency can be achieved for larger jurisdictions. But smaller jurisdictions, how do you hope to sell this to smaller jurisdictions when it might be less valuable and there might be in terms of the efficiency of it?
Right. So if you heard before, it took Menifee 10 hours to do this. And so we expect a small jurisdiction, it could take the same amount of time. So importantly, though, it will take longer to process enough permits to recoup the 10 hours. So for example, if it's about 10 hours if it's about an hour per plan review, that means 10 plan reviews. So ultimately, for a smaller jurisdiction, I find it difficult to suggest that even if they process 10 permits a year, it could still be a return on their investment to do that. In addition, as I said, there are some costs to adopting, which is time and resources to participate in some meetings. In addition, and actually, if they don't have an online system already that they're doing online applications, it's actually faster to adopt SolarAPP as a standalone function if they want to do that. And so we have tailored this specifically to reduce the amount of impact or cost it would have on jurisdictions to adopt, regardless of their size, economic income status, or geography. And so the limiting factor for jurisdictions remains the code years, and that is important for them to understand and be able to consider improving or updating those to be able to use SolarAPP. But I find it, we have stressed and worked very hard to reduce the time and resources needed for smaller jurisdictions. In addition, it's totally fine if a small jurisdiction doesn't want to rock the boat. We're not requiring them to adopt SolarAPP. So if they don't process very many permits, they're fine with their system. That's okay. They can wait until solar becomes more significant in their area. Again, the focus is really on those higher volume solar jurisdictions that are struggling. And this tool helps them do that. In addition, though, for folks that want to improve their process, they can still do that. So this is the tool that's available to anybody who wants it.
Thank you, Jeff. So we're running close to time here, so I'll just ask two more questions. First question is, did you say that Pima and Tucson reduced permit costs? Can you share how much, or do you have a sense of how much?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure on the exact number, but I think they reduced, ultimately what they did is they reduced the plan review portion of the fee. Why did they do that? Because they were no longer performing the plan review. So a lot of jurisdictions in general do need to do fee studies to evaluate what's an appropriate fee. And so ultimately Pima and County, and everyone will have to think about that plan review piece. And so Pima and County reduced it by about $25 or so, maybe 30, because that was the plan review component of their permitting fee. And so functionally, SolarAPP costs about $25 for the contractor. So net total, it's about $6 less to run a permit through SolarAPP than it is to run a permit through their traditional process. In addition, they're considering going forward to continuing to revisit their permitting fees. Of course, Pleasant Hill, California did not change their permitting fee, and will do that and consider permitting fees in upcoming permit studies or fee studies. And so it is important to stress that SolarAPP does not require any adjustment of fees whatsoever, but some jurisdictions are changing those based on the fact that SolarAPP is doing the plan review on their behalf.
Great. Okay, last question, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff, for any concluding remarks. The last question is, why not partner with other municipal software providers to integrate SolarAPP Plus so that municipalities aren't having to do two programs and be trained on both?
So my apologies. That is actually what we're doing. So if you are using a government software platform today, SolarAPP is designed to integrate with that system. So if you're using some government software today, we are working with the top ones like Acela, Tyler Tech, Central Square, and others to be able to make this as seamless as possible, which is what we've already done with Menifee in the context of their Acela Citizen Access Government Software Platform. So from the jurisdiction's perspective, there is no additional training required on SolarAPP and how it works with your system beyond training inspectors to understand the new documentation that they would be getting from your existing system.
Great. Well, that does it for questions. Do you have just a couple of sentences of concluding remarks or parting shots you want to say, Jeff, before we wrap?
Sure. Yeah, thanks so much for your time, everybody, today. Really appreciate it. If anyone does have any follow-up questions or wants to get an in-depth technical demo of the SolarAPP to discuss with your permitting offices in particular or across your entire state, we are happy and willing to do that. Please, by all means, as I said before, reach out to me via email or at the SolarAPP website, and we will engage you going forward. Again, the goal here is to make sure that this voluntary product that provides time savings for both the contractor and the jurisdiction. We're hoping to get this into every jurisdiction across the country as soon as possible. So please do reach out to us going forward with any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was terrific. It was a great presentation, and it seems like a really great tool. And I also want to thank our audience for attending and all the great questions you asked today. Before we close, I just want to tell you about some upcoming webinars. Tomorrow, there'll be a webinar on how low and moderate income solar programs are evaluated, trends and best practices. So you can join me from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow for that. And then next Wednesday, we're going to have a webinar on evaluating the financial performance of Connecticut's low and moderate income solar lease program. Again, that's also from 1 to 2, and you can register at the URL on the screen. Thanks so much, everybody. Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Nate. So before we go, I'm going to put up some contact info for Nate and for the Clean Energy States Alliance. Again, you can find out information about our upcoming webinars on our website, cset.org/webinars. Thank you, Nate and Jeff. That was great. Thank you, everyone who attended. And we hope to see you at our webinar tomorrow and at our other upcoming webinars. Bye, everyone.